High maintenance wall. How the censorship of friction drives Dutch segregation. The prevailing narrative surrounding segregation in major Dutch cities like Amsterdam and Rotterdam is one of demographics and geography. Academics point to income inequality, the allocation of social housing, or the legacy of post war labor migration to explain why our society is fractured into parallel worlds. We are told that people live apart because of where they can afford to live or because of historical policy failures. But this diagnosis misses the psychological reality of everyday life. The deepest divide in the Netherlands is not spatial, it's communicative. The real segregator in modern Dutch society is the systemic censorship of unfiltered critique regarding minority communities. In a well meaning but deeply flawed effort to combat racism, prejudice, and discrimination, our public institutions, media, and cultural gatekeepers have effectively outlawed friction. By suppressing dissent and sanitizing open critique, they have broken the mechanisms of natural social integration. This enforced silence has not created harmony. Instead, it has introduced a profound social anxiety, turning everyday cross cultural interaction into a high stakes, high effort ordeal. When the social cost of misunderstanding is laid so low that any critique can be labeled as bigotry, the majority chooses the path of least resistance, total evasion. The parallel societies we see today are the direct result of a majority population choosing to withdraw into spaces where they no longer have to walk on eggshells. To understand how this dynamic functions, one must first look at how critique and controversy are handled in the Dutch public square. When a public figure, a politician, or an ordinary citizen voices an unfiltered opinion about integration, religious friction, or cultural behavior, the mainstream response is rarely to engage with the substance of the argument. Instead, the institutional apparatus immediately moves to censor, deplatform, or heavily sanitize the expression. When the media reports on the events, they routinely omit the raw text or the exact context of what was said. The public is simply informed that something offensive or something discriminatory has happened. This creates a dangerous information vacuum. By censoring the actual dissent, other Dutch people are prevented from knowing the full scope of what is actually being thought or felt about minority communities. They are denied the raw data required to form a collective judgment on whether an expression is genuinely malicious, partially true, or merely a clumsy observation. Human psychology abhors an information vacuum, and in the absence of facts, the imagination takes over. When people are told that an unmentionable, offensive thing has been uttered, they naturally assume things to be far worse than they really are. They assume the critique was monstrously hateful rather than a reflection of ordinary, messy societal friction. This escalation of imagination fundamentally impedes any discussion founded on facts. You cannot debate a trend, a cultural clash, or a neighborhood grievance if the vocabulary required to describe it has been preemptively banned as harmful. Because the actual arguments are obscured to prevent harm through parentheses, the public conversation shifts entirely away from reality and into the realm of abstract morality. The underlying issues, whether they concern safety in specific urban boroughs, linguistic stagnation, or divergent social values, remain entirely unaddressed. The majority notices the silence. They observe that certain topics are radioactive, and they internalize the lesson that speaking openly about minorities carries a severe reputational risk. Consequently, people stop talking about these arguments altogether. They bury their observations, and in doing so, they begin to view the minority communities associated with these arguments not as neighbors, but as social landmines. The suppression of open critique has a direct, paralyzing effect on interpersonal relationships. When a society outlaws bluntness and lowers the bar for what constitutes racism to an absurdly sensitive level, it alters the fundamental rules of human interaction. It transforms minority individuals in the subconscious mind of the majority into, free parentheses, difficult or, quote, high maintenance, unquote, entities. In traditional Dutch culture, social interactions are historically defined by directness. The concept of bespreekbaarheid, the idea that anything can and should be discussed openly, is a cornerstone of mainstream social cohesion. If a native Dutch person behaves rudely, works inefficiently, or holds a frustrating viewpoint, their peers will generally tell them directly. It is a low effort, high honesty framework. But when interacting with a minority member, this standard directness is suddenly weaponized by institutional norms. A blunt critique of behavior can instantly be reinterpreted as a microaggression, unconscious bias, or systemic discrimination. To avoid this label, members of the majority must engage in a constant, exhausting process of self-censorship. They must monitor their tone, curate their vocabulary, suppress their natural humor, and second guess their intentions before every sentence. Every interaction becomes a high effort task. Human beings are inherently wired to seek social environments that require low emotional and cognitive energy. We naturally gravitate towards spaces where the rules are predictable, stable, and effortless. If interacting with a specific demographic requires a mental checklist just to ensure one isn't accused of bigotry, that demographic becomes, by definition, high maintenance. The result of this dynamic is not active hatred. The native majority does not look at minorities with malice or a desire to cause harm. Rather, they experience social fatigue. They look at the situation and decide, subconsciously, that the effort required to bridge the gap is simply too high. They recognize that minorities have become part of a larger systemic problem that society refuses to discuss honestly, and they realize they cannot solve it individually. Therefore, the way of least resistance is to not frequent minorities at all. It is far easier to structure one's life so that interactions with minority communities are entirely avoided. The majority chooses to live, work, and socialize in bubbles where the issue of race and discrimination is more or less irrelevant to bring up. They choose neighborhoods, sport clubs, schools, and workplaces where they can blend with people who share the exact same cultural codes, spaces where they can relax and speak freely without the terror of crossing an invisible, shifting line of offensiveness. This evasion is quiet, polite, and entirely devastating to the fabric of an integrated society. The institutional pressure to remain completely blameless in the eye of anti-racism norms produces another highly destructive byproduct, a reactionary artificial overcompensation by progressives and institutional figures. Terrified of being perceived as intolerant, these individuals adopt a standard of hyper-politeness and unearned praise towards minorities. They become overly nice, showering minority individuals with a curated performative warmth that they rarely extend to their native peers. This performative kindness is deeply insidious because it is fundamentally dishonest. These progressives are not acting out of a genuine organic liking for the person in front of them. They are acting out of fear of their own shadow. They are using the minority individual as a canvas to display their own moral purity. In doing so, they establish a blatant double standard. They treat the minority person not as an equal, robust human peer who can handle standard social friction, disagreement, or critique, but as a fragile, highly sensitive object that must be protected from the harshness of reality. This is, in itself, a form of soft condescension. When you refuse to hold someone to the same standard of accountability, bluntness, and critique that you apply to everyone else, you are implicitly stating that they are not equal. Moreover, this double standard is incredibly tiresome to maintain. Genuinely human connections are built on the ability to disagree, to push back, and to laugh at shared absurdities without fear. An environment of forced politeness is sterile and exhausting, because the native majority senses the profound artificiality of this performative standard. Their subconscious desire to withdraw deepens. They realize that they cannot have a normal, relaxed relationship with people who require a specialized, hypervigilant protocol. The overcompensation designed to bring people together ends up pushing them further apart, ensuring that any cross cultural contact remains superficial, transactional, and entirely segregated. When you combine the information vacuum created by vague censorship, the social evasion driven by communication fatigue, and the artificiality of performative kindness, the inevitable outcome is the consolidation of parallel societies. The divide in Dutch cities is no longer defined by old fashioned ethnic prejudice, but by a choice of cultural orbit. On one side, we have the mainstream, established culture. This orbit is not defined by progressivism or political alignment, but by linguistic and behavioral assimilation. To belong to this group, a person must speak the language fluently, with minimal foreign inserts, utilizing the standard idioms and cultural shorthand that signal an intuitive understanding of Dutch life. This group is ethnically diverse. It includes native Dutch people, individuals of mixed heritage, and integrated minorities. But because it represents the dominant established society, its members hold a vast array of political opinions, varying widely from the far left to the conservative right. It is a non monolithic space because its participants feel secure in their belonging. On the other side stands the parallel culture, a distinct subculture that explicitly defines itself by its opposition to the majority. This counterculture binds its members together through a shared identity of rejection, after adopting a negative or defensive view of the native majority. Crucially, this parallel society attracts not just first or second generation immigrants, but anyone who feels excluded from or hostile to the mainstream establishment. Because it functions as a counterculture, it demands strict conformity in language, dress, and attitude. Adopting the linguistic codes of or social graces of the mainstream is viewed within this group as a betrayal. The tragic paradox of the modern Dutch city is that our institutional framework has actively accelerated the growth of this parallel counterculture. By censoring the unfiltered critique that would allow mainstream society to honestly confront the friction points of integration, the establishment has made it impossible for the mainstream culture to absorb new populations naturally. Integration requires friction. It requires the ability to say, this behavior is unacceptable, or this cultural practice does not fit here, without the conversation being shut down by accusations of racism. When you ban that friction, you prevent the formation of a collective, fact based judgment. You deny the majority the tools to integrate others through honest communication, and you deny minorities the opportunity to understand the genuine expectations of the society they live in. Instead, you create a social minefield where the only safe option for the majority is to look away, walk to the other side of the street, and retreat into a unaccented, comfortable bubble where the problem can be ignored. Conclusion. The current state of Dutch urban segregation is a sobering reminder that forced harmony is the enemy of genuine integration. The well-meaning crusade to eradicate discrimination by policing language and censoring critique has achieved the exact opposite of its intended goal. It has not eliminated prejudice, it has merely driven it underground, while simultaneously paralyzing the healthy social instinct of the majority population. By lowering the bar for racism to a level that requires hypervigilance and emotional exhaustion, our institutions have incentivized segregation. They have made the path of least resistance, the complete evasion of minority communities, the most logical choice for an ordinary citizen who simply wishes to live a low-stress life. The result is a society that appears remarkably tolerant on paper, but is profoundly fractured in reality. Until we dismantle this wall of censorship and allow for unfiltered, fact-based, and uncomfortable critique, the divide in our cities will continue to widen. True integration cannot be manufactured through performative kindness or institutional silencing. It requires a society robust enough to handle its own friction, blunt enough to speak the truth, and mature enough to realize that avoiding a conversation is the ultimate form of separation.